Pacific, 1944. The air still carried the smell of cordite and burnt palm trees. Waves rolled over a blackened beach littered with the debris of war. Splintered helmets, twisted rifles, and the silent forms of men who had fought only hours earlier. Smoke curled from the hills where Japanese artillery had fired until the last gun fell silent. Across the shoreline, American engineers marked landing zones while medics worked in shallow pits of sand. The island was quiet now, except for the restless surf and the faint hum of a generator. Then amid the wreckage came a sound and the sharp crack of a bat. A white ball arced across the gray sky, cutting through the smoke. Laughter followed, raw, human, defiant. A group of American soldiers, their uniforms still stained with salt and gunpowder, were playing baseball. They had cleared a patch of the beach and marked bases with ration tins. Helmets served as gloves. The pitcher wound up, the batter swung, and for a brief moment the war vanished. From the hillside, a group of captured Japanese officers watched in disbelief. To them, the sight was incomprehensible. Hours after slaughter, their enemies were laughing, playing a child's game as if death had not just walked among them. The Bushido Code would never allow such behavior, to fight one moment and jest the next. But for the Americans, it wasn't disrespect. It was defiance, the refusal to let war erase their humanity. That afternoon, under a sun veiled by smoke, baseball became more than a game. It became a declaration that even here, among ruins and graves, life would go on. To understand how that extraordinary moment came to define the contrast between two armies and two civilizations, we must return to the war that made it possible. By 1944, the Pacific conflict had reached its breaking point. The United States, after clawing its way across thousands of miles of ocean, was now hammering at the walls of Japan's empire. The island-hopping campaign, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, was both brutal and methodical. Each victory was measured not in miles, but in bodies. For every coral atoll seized, for every strip of volcanic rock captured, thousands of men burned, drowned, or were torn apart in the crossfire. The Pacific was no conventional battlefield. It was fought in steaming jungles, on coral reefs, and in volcanic ash, far from home, with supply lines stretched thin and morale constantly tested. The Japanese Empire had fortified its outer islands with a single idea: every soldier must fight to the death. No surrender was not an order. It was ideology. The Bushido Code demanded death before capture. To die for the emperor was honor. To be taken alive was shame. For the Americans, this created a grim psychological war. Their enemy would rather die than yield. On Tarawa, entire Japanese garrisons fought to annihilation. On Saipan, soldiers and civilians leapt from cliffs to avoid capture. On Iwo Jima, the defenders built a labyrinth of tunnels beneath the rock, forcing every inch of ground to be fought for. Grenade by grenade, flamethrower by flamethrower. The toll was immense. Heat stroke, malaria, and exhaustion stalked the ranks. Yet the U.S. command understood something profound. A soldier's spirit could not survive on discipline alone. Between battles, men needed a taste of home, a reminder of the life they were fighting to return to. Baseball, more than anything else, became that lifeline. From the first landings in the Pacific, baseball followed the troops. It arrived in duffel bags, on supply ships, and even in the pockets of officers. The War Department issued bats, gloves, and balls as part of morale programs. Commanders were encouraged to let their men rest, compete, and laugh, not as distraction but as healing. On Guadalcanal, Marines cleared airstrips by day and played catch at dusk. On Bougainville, they batted coconuts with rifle stocks. On Saipan, they drew diamonds in the sand where blood had dried only days before. It was more than recreation. Baseball was identity. To Americans, it represented fairness, democracy, and freedom. Every man had a turn at bat. Every man had a chance to win. That sense of equality, of order through play, stood in direct contrast to Japan's rigid militarism. To the Japanese soldier, war was ritual. To the American, it was duty. But life still belonged to the individual. Japanese officers often mistook these games for weakness. They saw laughter where they expected solemnity, play where they expected discipline. But that laughter was strength. That stubborn normalcy was survival. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle once wrote that the American soldier could endure hell as long as he could make it look like home for 10 minutes. Baseball was those 10 minutes. By 1944, the U.S. military had even formalized leagues across the Pacific. Teams represented divisions, ships, even bomber squadrons. Stars and stripes printed game results from newly captured islands. Baseballs traveled in the same crates as ammunition. After anyway talk, soldiers built a diamond beside the lagoon, still littered with Japanese wreckage. Officers and privates played side by side. When a foul ball rolled into the surf, Marines dove after it, laughing like boys. To the Japanese, it was inconceivable. Their world was one of unbroken sacrifice. To play amid death was unthinkable. A captured officer later wrote in his diary, "The enemy shows no respect for the dead, yet they laugh among the ruins. They are strange men, children who kill." But he misunderstood. Those children were preserving sanity in a world that had lost it. The irony was that Japan had once loved baseball. The game had arrived there in the 1870s, brought by American teachers. By the 1930s, it was a national passion, but wartime propaganda twisted it. During militarization, baseball was renamed Yakyu, stripped of its Western roots. Bats and gloves gave way to rifles and bayonets. To the soldiers now watching Americans play, the game was a ghost, a reminder of peace long forgotten. As the Pacific Campaign entered its final, bloodiest phase, on Tinian, Palayu, and Okinawa, both sides were stretched beyond endurance. Yet even then, between air raids and artillery duels, American troops found time to play. They used broken rifles as bats, coconuts as balls, and laughed until nightfall. In letters home, they wrote that baseball was the only way to forget the screams. Back home, those images became legend. Newsreels showed soldiers playing baseball among the ruins, a living symbol of resilience. Through the lens of war correspondence, baseball itself had become a weapon of morale. By 1945, the Americans were closing in on Japan. The Japanese clung to death before surrender. The Americans clung to life. In foxholes, men spoke of home, of small-town ballparks, of summer nights, of the sound of a wooden bat cracking across a field. So when those Japanese officers watched Americans playing baseball after battle, laughing while the smoke still lingered, they were not seeing disrespect. They were witnessing the essence of the American spirit, the power to live amid death. What they could not yet know was that this simple game, this quiet defiance, would one day bridge the gap between their nations. But before peace could come, both sides still had to walk through fire. As the Pacific Campaign reached its brutal end, baseball would evolve from pastime to something deeper, a quiet rebellion against the madness of war itself. The sound of baseballs hitting makeshift gloves echoed strangely against the backdrop of artillery craters and twisted palm trunks. It was 1945, and on the shattered islands of the Pacific, that sound meant something powerful. It meant life, stubborn, ordinary, defiant life. To American troops, baseball was more than a pastime. It was identity carried into chaos. The game followed them from the ship decks of the Navy to the muddy airstrips of the Army Air Forces. They played between missions, between shellings, even between burials. Each inning was a reminder that they were still human, not machines of destruction, but men who dreamed of open fields and sunlight untainted by smoke. At first, even some American commanders didn't understand. How could men who had seen such horror play as if they were home? But the military psychologists knew better. They had studied morale since the Great War. Soldiers under constant combat stress needed ritual, not religion or ceremony, but familiar rhythm. Baseball, with its steady repetition and clear rules, offered that. One officer in the Pacific called it organized sanity. The Japanese, meanwhile, saw something very different. Reports from captured officers described American soldiers as carefree and undisciplined, incapable of understanding honor. In their eyes, such behavior disrespected both the dead and the emperor. But those reports revealed more than contempt. They revealed confusion. The Japanese military machine, steeped in centuries of Bushido, believed that war consumed the soul entirely. There was no space for laughter, no room for games. That belief had hardened during Japan's long campaign in Asia. From Nanking to the Philippines, soldiers had been taught that emotion was weakness. A warrior's worth was measured in endurance, not humanity. Compassion was dangerous. Mercy unthinkable. It was an ethos that produced fearless fighters, but also men broken by its weight. The Americans fought under a different sun. Their strength came not from discipline alone, but from contrast, from remembering what peace looked like. When a GI played baseball, he wasn't mocking death. He was reclaiming life from its grasp. That difference defined the Pacific War in ways that statistics never could. Across dozens of islands, the same scene repeated itself. A captured airfield, still smoking, a row of tents pitched beside wrecked Japanese pillboxes, and in the distance, a group of men laughing, playing catch. It became so common that even war correspondents like Ernie Pyle and Robert Sherrod began to note it in their field reports. "They play," Pyle wrote from Okinawa, "not because the world is sane, but because they need to believe it can be." The Japanese who witnessed it couldn't reconcile it with what they'd been told. Propaganda had painted Americans as barbarians, selfish, decadent men without discipline. Yet these same barbarians shared cigarettes with their enemies, tended their wounded, and laughed amid rubble. To the Japanese prisoners, the contradiction was dizzying. How could men so capable of firebombing cities also find joy in something as simple as a ball game? In one recorded incident on Saipan, U.S. Marines set up a game within sight of a Japanese POW camp. The prisoners, gaunt and silent behind barbed wire, watched for hours. When one Marine struck a long ball into the fence, it bounced into the camp. A Japanese soldier picked it up, examined it curiously, and tossed it back. The Americans cheered. The guards said nothing. But among the prisoners, something shifted. A tiny fracture in the wall of indoctrination. Baseball was not unknown to them. Before the war, Japan had loved the game. High schools and universities had competed fiercely in it, and the country had even produced professional stars. But war had turned that joy into something shameful, a relic of American corruption. To see the enemy revive it so freely was unsettling, almost sacrilegious. One Japanese officer later recalled that the sight of Americans playing baseball after battle was like watching ghosts mock the dead. Yet years later, that same officer would write, "I understand now. They played because they could afford to be human." For the Americans, that humanity was essential to survival. Between missions, soldiers needed distraction from fear. Baseball offered teamwork and simplicity. It reminded them of family, friends, and life beyond the jungle. The Military Special Services Division distributed thousands of bats, gloves, and balls throughout the Pacific. Even when supplies ran short, men improvised. A wooden plank became a bat. A coconut wrapped in rags became a ball. The games might last only minutes before a shelling or air raid interrupted. But those minutes mattered. In a letter from Tinian, a Navy Seabee described a game played beside a half-sunken barge. "The water was full of debris and smoke, but we played like it was the 4th of July back home." That mixture of defiance and nostalgia fueled American resilience. It was morale disguised as recreation. The contrast with the Japanese garrisons was striking. Hidden deep in caves, starving and isolated, the defenders lived in ritualized death. Many officers forbade laughter, calling it dishonor. They performed ceremonies before suicide charges, writing final poems before detonating grenades. When captured, they expected humiliation and death, not baseball. So when American soldiers laughed and played in the aftermath of bombardment, it wasn't simply strange to them, it was terrifying. It hinted at something unbreakable, something Japan's ideology could not explain. To the Americans, though, these small games were never about power. They were about continuity. Baseball, with its innings and cycles, mirrored the rhythm of life: struggle, pause, renewal. Even as their world burned, they kept playing because the game itself symbolized faith that life would continue. By late 1945, as the war neared its end, photographs began to circulate showing baseball games played amid bombed-out landscapes. One image from Okinawa showed Marines playing on a cratered field, smoke rising in the distance. Another from the Philippines showed GIs tossing a ball beside a destroyed Japanese tank. To civilians back home, those photos became symbols of American resilience. To Japanese viewers after the war, they were bewildering, almost surreal. Yet those games left a deeper legacy than anyone could have imagined. When the occupation began, General Douglas MacArthur's administration used baseball as a tool of reconstruction. American troops organized exhibition games in Tokyo and Osaka. They invited Japanese spectators. Many who had once despised the sport returned to watch, cautiously at first, then with genuine excitement. The crack of the bat became the sound of post-war renewal. What had once been a symbol of the enemy became a bridge between nations. By 1946, baseball was not just tolerated, it was celebrated again in Japan. American soldiers who had played for survival now played for peace. And yet back in those final years of war on those lonely islands, no one could have imagined that outcome. For the men there, baseball was something simpler, a fragile thread of home stretching across the ocean, keeping their sanity intact amid the collapse of civilization. When a Japanese officer saw American soldiers playing after bombardment, he wasn't witnessing arrogance. He was witnessing hope. Hope that even amid ruin, the human spirit could still remember joy, transition. But that hope would be tested in the war's last, most violent stages, on the blood-soaked shores of Okinawa, where play and death stood side by side, and where the true meaning of baseball amid war would be seared into history. Okinawa, April 1945. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War had begun. Waves of American troops poured ashore under gray skies and relentless artillery. The island, barely 60 miles long, would soon become one of the bloodiest battlefields in human history. The Japanese defenders, more than 100,000 strong, had turned its hills, ridges, and caves into a fortress. They would not yield easily. The beaches, churned by naval bombardment, were a landscape of chaos. Marines advanced under machine gun fire, their boots sinking into sand blackened by explosions. Smoke rose from the inland hills, where Japanese artillery guns barked from hidden tunnels. The smell of sulfur, cordite, and wet earth clung to everything. It was war in its most primal form. Mud, fear, and fire. For 82 days, the Battle of Okinawa raged. American forces fought inch by inch through the island's defensive rings, facing suicide charges, night assaults, and constant ambushes. The Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, ordered his men to fight to the last breath. Civilians were caught between the armies, many coerced into mass suicides by the imperial military. It was, as General Simon Buckner Jr. wrote, a war without mercy, where death was the only constant. Yet amid that storm of destruction, the Americans still found time to play. It began, as always, after the guns fell silent for a few hours. Between bombardments in the lulls that followed the day's slaughter, men found open ground, a burned-out field, a stretch of beach, even the ruins of a sugar mill, and played baseball. Helmets became bases, a stick became a bat, a rubber ball, sometimes scavenged from supply crates, became the link between this world and the one they had left behind. There are photos of it, grainy black and white images taken by army photographers. In one, soldiers in muddy fatigue stand barefoot, laughing, the horizon behind them still choked with smoke. In another, a Marine pitches underhand while a medic cheers from the sidelines. In the distance, smoke from naval shelling curls upward like gray ghosts. Japanese prisoners and civilians sometimes watched from a distance, stunned. To them it was unthinkable. The very men who had unleashed hellfire on their island were now smiling, laughing, playing a game. They could not understand. Their world had been built on the idea that war consumed everything, that once you took life, you forfeited the right to joy. Yet here were their conquerors defying that belief. For the Americans, though, baseball was not mockery. It was ritual. After days of fighting through caves and minefields, after carrying bodies from the mud, the act of playing ball brought something sacred: normalcy. The rhythm of the game mirrored the heartbeat of home. Pitch, swing, catch, repeat. The same motions they had known as boys in quiet towns thousands of miles away. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. How could men play baseball in the midst of so much suffering? But for those soldiers, it was the only way to keep from breaking. The same men who played on that scorched island would later describe it as therapy with a glove. One Marine wrote in his diary, "You hit that ball and for a second you're not here. You're home." Okinawa's violence reached a crescendo in May. The Americans faced fanatical resistance in the south, particularly around Shuri Castle, the heart of the Japanese defensive line. Rain turned the battlefield into rivers of mud. Tanks sank. Trucks stalled. Men lived in flooded foxholes crawling with maggots and rats. Every inch forward cost lives. The 6th Marine Division lost thousands. Yet when the storm passed, when the guns paused, baseball returned. Commanders tolerated it. Some even encouraged it. They knew morale was the only thing keeping their men from collapse. Chaplains blessed the makeshift games. Photographers captured them. And somewhere amid that devastation, between death and duty, the sound of laughter echoed again. The Japanese, watching from the hills, were bewildered. Intercepted diary entries from surviving officers reveal their disbelief. One wrote, "The Americans do not understand war. They kill without hesitation and yet find joy like children. It is both terrifying and enviable." It was envy, though few would admit it, because behind that laughter lay something Japan's war machine had stripped away from its men: the permission to feel human. The Americans, despite all their power, still allowed themselves moments of innocence. That was their strength. By June, the island was a graveyard. The Japanese army had been annihilated. General Ushijima committed suicide rather than surrender. The Americans counted their own dead, over 12,000 lost, 50,000 wounded. Yet even as the guns finally went quiet, the smell of smoke still clinging to their uniforms, the men of the 10th Army set up one more baseball game near Yontan Airfield. A war correspondent described the scene. There were still fires burning in the hills. Graves marked with helmets dotted the field's edge. Yet the men played anyway. They cheered when someone hit a line drive, booed when someone dropped a catch. They played until the sun went down, and for those hours the war seemed far away. In that surreal landscape, death on one side, laughter on the other, baseball became more than recreation. It became a statement of survival. Each swing of the bat was an act of defiance against despair. Each inning was proof that humanity could endure even when surrounded by ruin. The Japanese who witnessed it, particularly captured officers, carried that memory into captivity. Many later admitted that it changed how they saw their enemy. These Americans were not the monsters their propaganda had described. They were men, brutal in war, yes, but capable of compassion, capable of joy. One Japanese POW later recalled, "We could not comprehend how they could play after such killing. But slowly I began to think, perhaps they played because they could." That realization, small and fragile, was the seed of understanding that would later grow into something larger: the post-war reconciliation between two nations once locked in total hatred. In the last weeks of the battle, American military bands arrived to boost morale. Between concerts, soldiers organized tournaments. News of these games made it into Stars and Stripes. The headline read, "GI-9 wins in shadow of Shuri Ridge." It wasn't just a headline. It was metaphor. Victory amid devastation. Humanity amid ruin. When the war finally ended in August 1945, with the surrender of Japan after the atomic bombings, many of those same soldiers returned home with their gloves and memories. For them, baseball had not been an escape from war. It had been their way through it. And for the Japanese officers who had once stared in disbelief, it had been their first glimpse into the heart of their conquerors. The world had changed forever. But the image of those games, American soldiers laughing on bombed-out fields while their enemies watched in silence, would linger long after the last shot was fired. Transition. When the guns fell silent and the occupation began, baseball would once again return to Japan, this time not as a mystery but as a bridge. What began as confusion on the battlefield would become a shared language of peace. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked not only the end of a war, but the beginning of an identity's reconstruction. Cities lay in ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wastelands of silence. Tokyo, once alive with color and sound, was reduced to endless stretches of charred timber and stone. The nation's spirit, long bound by the code of Bushido and the illusion of invincibility, had shattered. Into that ruin came the victors, not with whips but with blueprints, bulldozers, and something profoundly unfamiliar: kindness. The Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, sought not to destroy Japan but to rebuild it. It was one of the most extraordinary transitions in modern history. An enemy empire turned into a democratic ally within a few short years. But the success of that transformation rested not only on policies and reconstruction plans. It rested on the subtle power of culture, on the very human bridges that soldiers and civilians began to build, quietly and unexpectedly. One of those bridges was baseball. For the Americans stationed across Japan from 1945 onward, baseball was the language they carried with them. It was what they played on airfields, in barracks, in open lots beside burned-out factories. The Japanese, wary at first, watched the games just as their officers once had on the islands. But now they were not prisoners. They were survivors, civilians emerging from hunger and humiliation. And when the soldiers invited them to join, they hesitated only briefly. Then slowly the ball began to pass between former enemies. MacArthur understood the symbolism. He encouraged the sport's revival as part of Japan's cultural recovery. Baseball, he believed, could serve as a safe, apolitical expression of optimism, a way for a defeated people to reconnect with the world. In 1946, the Nippon Professional Baseball League was re-established under American supervision. Soldiers from the 8th Army attended games, sometimes even joining local teams to fill rosters. For the Japanese public, the sight was surreal. American soldiers, once the bringers of fire and destruction, now stood shoulder to shoulder with them on baseball fields. The same gloves that had crossed the Pacific in war were now used to rebuild trust. Newspapers began to print photos of children playing catch with GIs in the rubble of Tokyo. "They bring us smiles," one mother told a reporter from the Asahi Shimbun. "It has been years since we heard laughter." Baseball diamonds sprang up beside schools and shrines marked out with chalk on scorched earth. For the first time since the early 1930s, Japanese youth leagues began to form again. The symbolism did not escape notice. American journalists wrote that Japan has found its rhythm again, 9 innings at a time. For soldiers who had fought in Okinawa or Iwo Jima, the transformation was deeply personal. Some recognized faces, men they had once fought against, now standing in the same line waiting for soda and peanuts between games. Others found a strange comfort in the familiarity of it all, the rules, the cheers, the slow cadence of innings passing under the same sky that had once been filled with bombers. There were challenges, of course. Resentment lingered in the shadows. Some Japanese nationalists saw the spread of baseball as another act of cultural occupation, an Americanization of their defeated nation. Yet for many ordinary people, the game became something else, a neutral ground free from ideology. In the rhythm of pitching and catching, there was equality. No emperor, no victor, just 2 teams, 1 field, and a common language of effort and respect. In late 1945, American occupation forces organized a large exhibition in Tokyo. Thousands gathered to watch. Japanese spectators, many in tattered clothes, filled the bleachers. They watched as American teams played with an intensity that seemed both familiar and alien, shouting encouragement, grinning, sliding into bases. When the final out came, the crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. A reporter wrote that the cheers were not for victory or defeat, but for life returning. Soon after, the Japanese began reforming their own teams. Former players who had served in the Imperial Army returned to coach new generations. Bats were carved from leftover wood, gloves patched from military leather. Children scavenged baseballs from American supply depots, cleaning them and using them until the seams burst. Within a year, the sound of baseball, that crisp, sharp crack of bat-meeting ball, echoed once again through Japan's cities. For the Americans, it was a victory unlike any other. They had conquered a nation through force, but they were rebuilding it through humanity. Baseball was not officially part of the Marshall Plan for Asia, but its effect was as real as any policy. It gave shape to something no treaty could define: mutual understanding. Photographs from the period show the extraordinary change. In 1945, Americans were still wary of their surroundings, rifles slung across shoulders even as they played. By 1947, the guns were gone. The same soldiers who had once fought on beaches now pitched baseballs to Japanese school children. There was trust now, fragile, but growing. In many ways, baseball became a metaphor for the American approach to the occupation itself. The Japanese learned not through lectures, but through participation. They saw that Americans played by rules, accepted defeat gracefully, and believed in second chances. The structure of the game, fair play, order, respect for boundaries, mirrored the democratic ideals MacArthur sought to instill. Meanwhile, back in the United States, baseball was also transforming. Players returning from the Pacific brought home stories of the games they'd played in war zones. Some had used baseballs marked with saltwater stains from Saipan or Okinawa, Veterans formed leagues and military teams became part of baseball's folklore. To them, every inning was a small reminder that life could return to normal. The Japanese, for their part, embraced the sport as their own once more, not as imitation but as expression. Within just a few years, Japan's professional league rivaled its pre-war popularity. Stadiums filled again. Players like Tetsuharu Kawakami and Shigeru Mizuhara became household names. And when American major league teams toured Japan in the late 1940s and early 1950s, crowds of hundreds of thousands came to watch. One Japanese newspaper captured it perfectly. The same game that crossed the ocean with bullets has returned with friendship. For many Japanese veterans, those words held profound meaning. Some who had once looked upon American soldiers with hatred now took their sons to see American teams play. They recognized the same spirit, the laughter, the humility, the shared respect for the game. Baseball, which had once symbolized the incomprehensible behavior of an enemy, now represented hope. By the early 1950s, baseball had become Japan's national pastime once again, not because it was imposed, but because it had survived. Like the country itself, it had endured fire and found rebirth. In the decades that followed, the bond only deepened. Japanese players would eventually rise to global fame in the American leagues. The sport that once divided the two nations became their most enduring link. But in the ashes of 1945, that future was unimaginable. It began humbly, with a ball tossed between soldiers and children, with laughter echoing through ruins once haunted by silence. Transition. The war had ended, but what remained was the quiet proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, something fragile yet enduring had survived, the simple joy of play. In the end, the story of Americans playing baseball after bombardments was not just about sport, it was about survival. It was about the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to yield to darkness. On the blackened beaches of Saipan, in the Idai mud of Okinawa, and later in the shattered streets of Tokyo, a simple game became a symbol of something profound, that even amid war's cruelty, life could still find rhythm. The Japanese officers who once watched in disbelief saw an enemy unlike any they had imagined. They had been taught that the Americans were hollow men, creatures of indulgence, without honor. Yet what they witnessed were men who carried home, inside them, who played not to mock the fallen but to remind themselves what they were fighting to return to. That strength, quiet, unpretentious, deeply human, proved more enduring than any doctrine or empire. When peace finally came, the same game they once scorned became the heartbeat of a new Japan. Baseball filled the silence that bombs had left behind. Children played among the ruins. Laughter returned to streets where cries had once echoed, and somewhere in that laughter, two former enemies began to understand one another. Years later, as American and Japanese players stood together under bright stadium lights, no one could have imagined that the bridge between them had been built on those war-torn fields. A bat, a ball, a moment of humanity in the midst of devastation. That was the quiet miracle of baseball in war, not a story of victory, but of endurance. The proof that even after the world burned, mankind could still remember how to play.